Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce the communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this, and at the end have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole, an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be Rosa Luxemburg's Organizational Questions of the Russian Social Democracy, as to say, Leninism or Marxism. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but it is no replacement for the actual reading itself, for the sake of understanding the context. In addition, in the reading I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. With that said, let us get started with the reading. In this text, Rosa Luxemburg criticizes Lenin for his thesis on the organizational form of the party. According to her, Lenin's conception of the Central Committee is alleged that it should functionally be the only thinking organ, since it names all local committees, has a right to appoint effective organs of all local bodies, impose rules of party conduct, rule without appeal in terms of dissolution and reconstitution of local organs, and convert all other organs into executive limbs. However, this is a blanket position, according to Luxemburg, and it robs the working class movement of the capacity to properly develop. Communist thought arises and spreads according to the dialectical contradiction wherein the proletarian army is recruited and then they become aware of their objective in the struggle only after being recruited. These occur at the same time via the same mechanics. Therefore, tactics cannot be dictated from some externality, which is what she claims the Central Committee is. The party must be itself the proletariat, and the concentrated will of individuals and groups representative of the working class. The party is the self-centralism, quote-unquote, of the advanced sectors of the working class, who recognize that they must seek unity and centralization to achieve victory through theoretical analysis and practical experience of the working class. The history of the class struggle of the proletariat. However, since the party is a mass party and since the proletariat is a rule of the majority within its own party, a large contingent of workers need to be educated in the class struggle. Such education can only truly be achieved through freedom of expression both inside and outside the party. In addition, the proletariat's party will naturally achieve discipline. Discipline, which is distinct from absence of thought of executive organs or spontaneous coordination. Rather, it is a new form of discipline, which is freely assumed via liberating oneself mentally from habits of obedience and servility. Since the proletariat naturally develops the tools for its liberation, rather than focusing on directives for future struggle, which we cannot make strong determinations on, instead, we should educate about the class struggle and its necessity to eventually lead to revolutionary tension. Any attempts to put the power of all decision-making in an enclosed section of the party makes it conservative, thus making it sterile and unable to utilize all resources. To take productive action, the whole labor movement instead needs the liberty of action, which will allow them to educate themselves through struggle. Such external discipliners and decision-making is toxic. Organization of the mass party requires coordination and unification, which doesn't necessarily involve submission to a set of definite unchanging regulations, but instead to what is necessary for an organization to really flourish, which is 1. Political mobility, 2. Unflinching loyalty to principles, and 3. Concern for unity. If these are maintained, then any defects in a given movement will be corrected through praxis. The membership will then determine the organizational form according to their needs and the spirit which is engendered from shared discipline in maintaining the above. Luxemburg then says that opportunism arises out of material conditions, and hence the form of opportunism is dependent. It is ultimately acting without principles. It aims at achieving a specific immediate end goal without also paying attention to the whole of the needs of the movement. This is not something that is stopped through external disciplining, but rather through organizational structure matching your material conditions, while also avoiding the creation of conditions wherein mandates can be unquestionable or lacking strict definition in organizational structure. In addition, the proletariat must engage in independent and revolutionary action, as that will produce political responsibility and self-reliance, along with the aforementioned discipline and desire for centralization, which matches the conditions of their struggle. Such responsibility and self-reliance puts checks against opportunism and ambition. In order to deal with more individual forms of opportunism in the party, such as through all other classes and groups which protest the bourgeois order, including class traders, the party needs to bring them all into it, but bend them to the will of the proletarian struggle. Such an absorption of other social groups into the will of the proletariat requires a nucleus which can utilize party bylaws to maintain the dominance of the proletariat. It needs to have a strong basis in the party. The proletariat must remain the majority. It must have high political education, class consciousness, be able to use strict centralization, and severe discipline. Ultimately, the movement of the party is a dialectical one, emergent from the contradiction between the immediate interests of the proletariat and their social general ones, the revolution. It is this contradiction which allows for the party to develop and the proletariat to build up experiences, being and becoming. The mass organization can only develop within the limits of capitalist society, which is why it's key to maintain the ultimate goal as a constant focus. Opportunism stems from such immediacy, such unavoidable social conditions, and it is thereby impossible to anticipate and fully stop all potential opportunist deviations. Only movement, guided by Marxist theory and by historical experience in acting to resolve manifestations of opportunism, will actually defeat it. When in doubt, the proletariat as a whole must take action. Through this, the working class's collective unconscious will learn through experiences gained and create organizations which will deal with their problems. And that's the end of the general textual analysis. Now I will begin the full audiobook reading. I hope that you enjoyed the session and will attend next time as well. Welcome back. This is the United Marxist Pact, reading more investigation into worker organizations that can bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Today we'll be doing something a little different. I have recently, as you might have been able to hear in the previous session's recording, had significant, let's say, criticisms of the texts that we have been reading, mostly in terms of the lack of, the purposeful lack of clarity of structure. Evidently, the intent is for structure to organically develop according to the struggle, and to that end, they deny actually writing down, how to build that structure. Because apparently standardization is impossible or whatever. Actually, let me just reread this for the stream. The concept of having I was told, right, that one of those principles also is that we cannot have a model organization, and the organizational structure will always have to adapt to necessities of the work, right? Here's my response to this. Once we have the principles, it's time to apply those principles to formalize them in such a way that allows for a standardized format, allows for future localized development. And, the concept that having a structure makes something undynamic is something that's determined by the structure, whether it's dynamic or not. Structure doesn't remove options in some way. If you're to conceive of any fetters on dynamism to be a problem, then you should do away with all principles as well. If you want to ultimately maximize variety within the confines that achieve a specific goal, this includes the construction of a maximally dynamic structure with specifically prescribed principles of engagement. Structure increases freedom. All the principles lack any ability to be put into practice unless you have a party, and any party is going to have a structure whether you like it or not. If you don't have a way of articulating your structure, then you have no way of actually even engaging it. I can look internally at the structure of this thing that we're doing right now, right? I can look internally at the structure of the United Marxist Pact Discord server. I can tell you how it's organized from top to bottom, from side to side, the principles that inform its construction. I do this through rational self analysis, and I can tell someone else exactly how to replicate while giving them the tools to increase that dynamism. Yeah, a smaller server wouldn't have the numbers capable of doing what we do the exact way. So, in other words, a properly dynamic structure would also be able to take into account the numbers at hand, right? A cadre is going to operate differently than a party. These are both organizations, they're both structures, but they're going to have different, they're going to operate in different ways, but they're both structures. All viable organizations have a real structure, whether it's explicitly recognized or not. And I just simply don't understand what possible end is served by purposeful organizational obscurantism. Um, I can point to endless examples of incredibly dynamic organizations, including ones that are extremely hierarchical, like the military. It's extremely dynamic, despite having a highly disciplined and clear hierarchy, structure, and organization. This really can't be denied. The ability for an organization to be dynamic is part of its structure. Anyone can replicate the structure of the military just by investigating its organization, which is publicly known. I'm not saying I want to replicate a military organization. My point here is that simply expressing the organizational structure in verbal terms does not suddenly make it impossible to change, nor does it remove the dynamism inherent in whatever model you have. And yes, some models can be more dynamic than others, and this is sometimes a good thing. Sometimes, well, this entire thing has, binding decisions from the top affect people from the bottom, right? Uh, People, the lower levels, they have less dynamism because an external force is making binding decisions for them. This is a principle. This is a structural principle. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it reduces the dynamism. Is that good or bad? No, it simply is. Um, so, imagine if I tried to tell you to design your military solely on principles like victory and don't get killed and maintain this discipline, and then just hope that through social consensus in the face of the conditions that necessitate those principles, people just figure it out in the moment. And then you never write it down and you never systematize the structure that you've learned from. It's predicated on not learning from the past. There are things, so there are clearly common structures that this organic centralism recognizes. So it lists in another piece that I went through earlier, the Communist Party and the tradition of the left. Down here, it lists brings all forms of proletarian organization under its control. So, that's a structural thing. You need to have a dynamic structure capable of bringing in these other organizations. We can write that down, and then we can talk about how to achieve that. Binding authority from higher bodies to lower, that's a structural thing. How that is done is something that can be discussed. Strong party center with incontestable authority. Same versus the first. Pyramidal structure, many faces converging on one node that regulates and gives direction to the entire network. That is the most clear form of structure right there. Division of tasks according to rational plan. No privilege to higher position. Okay, that's a structural thing. No autonomy of branches. That's a structural thing. Division of labor to construct hierarchical differentiation. Militaristic format. That's a structural thing. Rotates members through position of party. No division of labor except by natural adaptation. That's a structural thing. None of these things I'm saying are bad or necessarily good. These are things that are learned through struggle. You know, all these things need structures to maintain and discipline these things and make sure that they're actually occurring. All these can be written down and expressed. All these can be determined and laid out like any military can determine it and lay out its own structure. We can then expand out, formulating more and more and making structure more and more clear. The great benefit of capitalism is that it's able to universalize production and standardize methodologies. And yet, organic structuralism, or organic centralism, excuse me, demands that we reject any standardization so as to achieve quote unquote dynamism. It's ridiculous, as if standardization steals away dynamism. It obviously doesn't. Capitalism is a ridiculously dynamic system. What are you talking about? Okay. All right. With that aside, with my criticisms aside, I wanted to move to something a little bit different, both for the sake of working through this and because it was recommended to me, and because this is an earlier piece that I have decided to input in here. This is the 1904 Organizational Questions of the Russian Social Democracy, that is to say, Leninism or Marxism, by Rosa Luxemburg. I should probably write Luxemburg here. Okay. So we're going to start with the editor's introduction right here. This document represents Rosa Luxemburg's contribution to the debate within the Russian Social Democratic movement on party organization and democratic centralism. Luxemburg joins Trotsky in warning of the dangers inherent in centralism. Okay, I disagree with that, but okay. And argues against the concentration of power in a central committee. From a socialist revolutionary perspective, Luxemburg puts forward compelling arguments against Lenin's conception of the Revolutionary Party. For other contemporary contributions to the debate, see Trotsky's Our Political Tasks and Lenin's What is to be Done and One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. Originally published as an article in 1904 under the title Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy in Iskra and Nezaid, later reprinted in pamphlet form titled Marxism versus Leninism, appeared in English in 1934 as Revolutionary Socialist Organization, published by Integer, and in 1935 as Leninism or Marxism by the Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation, Glasgow. In 1961, the University of Michigan Press reprinted the Integer translation, which has entered the public domain, in The Russian Revolution and Leninism or Marxism, with an introduction by Bertram Wolfe. It also appears under the title of Organizational Questions of Social Democracy as part of the 1970 Pathfinder Press compilation of Rosa Luxemburg Speaks. Okay, Section 1. Organizational Questions of the Russian Social Democracy. Part 1. An unprecedented task in the history of the socialist movement has fallen to the lot of the Russian social democracy. It is the task of deciding on what is the best socialist tactical policy in a country where absolute monarchy is still dominant. It is a mistake to draw a rigid parallel between the present Russian situation and that which existed in Germany during the years of 1879 to 90 when Bismarck's anti-socialist laws were in force. The two have one thing in common: police rule. Otherwise, they are in no way comparable. The obstacles offered to the socialist movement by the absence of democratic liberties are of relatively secondary importance. Even in Russia, the people's movement has succeeded in overcoming the barriers set up by the state. The people have found themselves a constitution, quote unquote, though a rather precarious one, in street disorders. Persevering in this course, the Russian people will in time attain complete victory over the autocracy. Whether that is bourgeois or socialist, is up for grabs, but ultimately the monarchy, according to Rosa Luxemburg, will fail because of the movement of the people. Continuing. The principal difficulty faced by socialist activity in Russia results from the fact that the country the domination of the bourgeoisie is veiled by an absolutist force. This gives socialist propaganda an abstract character, while immediate political agitation takes on a democratic revolutionary guise. Bismarck's anti-socialist laws put our movement out of constitutional bounds in a highly developed bourgeois society, where class antagonisms have already reached their full bloom in parliamentary contests. Here, by the way, lay the absurdity of Bismarck's scheme. The situation is quite different in Russia. The problem there is how to create a social democratic movement at a time when the state is not yet in the hands of the bourgeoisie. The circumstance has an influence on agitation, on the matter of transplanting socialist doctrine to Russian soil. It also bears in a peculiar and direct way on the question of party organization. Under ordinary conditions, that is, where the political domination of the bourgeoisie has preceded the socialist movement, the bourgeoisie itself instills in the working class the rudiments of political solidarity. At this stage, declares the Communist Manifesto, the unification of the workers is not yet the result of their own aspiration to unity, but comes as a result of the activity of the bourgeoisie, quote, which in order to attain its own political ends is compelled to set the proletariat in motion, end quote. In Russia, however, the social democracy must make up its own efforts in the entire historic period. It must lead the Russian proletariat from their present, quote, atomized condition, which prolongs the autocratic regime, to a class organization that would help them become aware of their historical objectives and prepare them to struggle against to achieve those objectives. The Russian socialists are obliged to undertake the building of an organization without the benefit of formal guarantees commonly found under bourgeois democratic setup. They do not dispose of the political raw material that in other countries is supplied by bourgeois society itself. Like God Almighty, they must have this organization arise out of the void, so to speak. How to effect a transition from the type of organization characteristic of the preparatory stage of the socialist movement, usually featured by disconnected local groups and clubs, with propaganda as principal activity, to the unity of a large national body suitable for concerted political action over the entire vast territory ruled by the Russian state. That is a specific problem which the Russian social democracy has mulled over for some time. Autonomy and isolation are the most pronounced characteristics of the old organizational type. It is, therefore, understandable why the slogan of persons who want to see an inclusive national organization should be centralism. At the party congress, it became evident that the term centralism does not completely cover the question of organization for the Russian social democracy. Once again, we have learned that no rigid formula confers the solution of any problem in the social movement. One step forward, two steps backward, written by Lenin, an outstanding member of the Iskra group, is a methodological exposition of the ideas of the ultra-centralist tendency in the Russian movement. The viewpoint presented with incomparable vigor and logic in this book is that of pitiless centralism. Laid down as principles are 1. The necessity of selecting and constituting a separate core, all the active revolutionists, as distinguished from the unorganized, the revolutionary mass supporting this elite. Lenin's thesis is that the Party Central Committee should have the privilege of naming all the local committees of the party. It should have the right to appoint the effective organs of all local bodies, from Geneva to Liège, from Tomsk to Irkutsk. It should also have the right to impose on all of them its own ready-made rules of party conduct. It should have the right to rule without appeal on such questions as the dissolution and reconstitution of local organizations. This way, the Central Committee could determine, to suit itself, the composition of the highest party organs. The Central Committee would be the only thinking element in the party. All other groupings would be its executive limbs. Let us take this. We're going to put that in here. So Lenin sees this as the Central Committee should ultimately be the only thinking organ. It names all local committees. It has the right to appoint effective organs of all local bodies. It imposes rules of party conduct, and it rules without appeal in terms of dissolution and reconstitution of local organs. And by doing all this, it converts all other organs into its executive limbs without them actually, having to do any thinking action themselves in this sense. Continuing. Lenin reasons that the combination of socialist mass movement with such a rigorously centralized type of organization is a specific principle of revolutionary Marxism. To support this thesis, he advances a series of arguments which we shall deal below. Generally speaking, it is undeniable that a strong tendency towards centralization is inherent in the social democratic movement. This tendency springs from the economic makeup of capitalism, which is essentially a centralizing factor. The social democratic movement carries on its activities inside the large bourgeois city. Its mission is to represent, within the boundaries of the national state, the class interests of the proletariat, and to oppose these common interests to all local and group interests. Therefore, the social democracy is, as a rule, hostile to any manifestations of localism or federalism. It strives to unite all workers and all worker organizations in a single party, no matter what national, religious, or occupational differences may exist among them. The social democracy abandons this principle and gives way to federalism only under exceptional circumstances, such as in the case of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I wish that she would explain that, but okay. It is clear that the Russian social democracy should not organize itself as a federative conglomerate of many national groups. It must rather become a single party for the entire empire. However, that's not really the question considered here. What we are considering is the degree of centralization necessary inside the unified single Russian party in view of the peculiar conditions under which it has to function. Looking at the matter from the angle of the formal tasks of social democracy, in its capacity as a party of class struggle, it appears at first that the power and energy of the party are directly dependent on the possibility of centralizing the party. However, these formal tasks apply to all active parties. In the case of social democracy, they are less important than is the influence of historical conditions. Capacities of party. However, okay. The social democratic movement is the first in the history of class society which reckons, in all its phases and through its entire course, on the organization and the direct independent action of the masses. Because of this, the social democracy creates an organizational type that is entirely different from these common to earlier revolutionary movements, such as those of the Jacobins and here to Blanqui. Lenin seems to dislike this fact when he presents in his book, page 140, the opinion of the revolutionary social democrat is nothing else than, quote, a Jacobin indissolubly joined to the organization of the proletariat, which has become conscious of its class interests, end quote. For Lenin, the difference between the social democracy and Blanquism is reduced to the observation that in place of a handful of conspirators, we have a class-conscious proletariat. He forgets that this difference implies a complete revision of our ideas on organization and, therefore, an entirely different conception of centralization and the relations existing between the party and the struggle itself. Blanquism did not count on the direct action of the working class. It therefore did not need to organize the people for the revolution. The people were expected to play their part only at the moment of revolution. Preparation for a revolution concerned only the little group of revolutionists armed for the coup. Indeed, to assure the success of the revolutionary conspiracy, it was considered wiser to keep the mass at some distance from the conspirators. Such a relationship could be conceived by the Blanquists only because there is no close contact between the conspiratorial activity of their organization and the daily struggle of the popular masses. The tactics and concrete tasks of the Blanquist revolutionaries had little connection with the elementary class struggle. They were freely improvised. They could, therefore, be decided on in advance and took the form of a ready made plan. In consequence of this, ordinary members of the organization became simple executive organs, carrying out the orders of a will fixed beforehand and outside their particular sphere of activity. They became the instruments of a central committee. Here we had the second peculiarity of conspiratorial centralism, the absolute and blind submission of the party sections to the will of the center, and the extensions of this authority to all parts of the organization. However, social democratic activity is carried on under radically different conditions. It arises historically out of the elementary class struggle. It develops and spreads in accordance with the following dialectical contradiction. The proletarian army is recruited and becomes aware of its objectives in the course of the struggle itself. The activity of the party organization, the growth of the proletarians' awareness of the objectives of the struggle, and the struggle itself are not different things separated chronologically and mechanically. They are only different aspects of the same struggle. There do not exist for the social democracy detailed in sets of tactics which the Central Committee can teach the party membership in the same way as troops are instructed in their training camps. Furthermore, the range of influences on the Socialist Party is constantly fluctuating with the ups and downs of the struggle in the course of which the organization is created and grows. Okay. All right. So Luxemburg says that social democracy arises and spreads according to a dialectical contradiction wherein the proletarian army is recruited and they become aware of its objective in the struggle after they are recruited in the course of the struggle. But the thing is, these occur at the same time and the same mechanics because, more people are coming into the party and then, they're leaving in accordance with the degree of the struggle and so on and so forth. So it's a constant process. I mean, I don't really agree with this. I understand where she's going with it, but anyway, like an army, right? An army might get more people into it by running a series of ad campaigns. And in those ad campaigns, yeah, it doesn't talk about the tactics or anything, but the people that are recruited through those ad campaigns don't really have anything to do with that. Now, I'm not saying that the social democratic movement is the same or that we should pursue such a thing, but I am saying that essentially I disagree with this conception that it is only capable of acting in this manner. Um, you know, anyway, back to the text. For this reason, social democratic centralism cannot be based on the mechanical subordination and blind obedience of party membership to the leading party center. For this reason, the social democratic movement cannot allow the erection of an airtight partition between the class-conscious nucleus of the proletariat already in the party and its immediate popular environment, the non-party sections of the proletariat. Now, the two principles on which Lenin centralism rests are precisely these. 1. The blind subordination in the smallest detail of all party organs to the party center, which alone thinks, guides, and decides for all. 2. The rigorous separation of the organized nucleus of revolutionaries from its social revolutionary surroundings. Such centralism is a mechanical transposition of the organizational principles of Blanquism into the mass movement of the socialist working class. In accordance with this view, Lenin defines his, quote, revolutionary social democrat as a, quote, Jacobin joined to the organization of the proletariat, which has become conscious of its class interests. The fact that the social democracy is not joined to the organization, the proletariat, it is itself the proletariat. And because of this, social democratic centralism is essentially different from the blankist centralism. It can only be the concentrated will of the individuals and groups representative of the working class. It is, so to speak, the quote, self centralism of the advanced sectors of the proletariat. It is the rule of the majority within its own party. The indispensable conditions for the realization of social democratic centralism are 1. The existence of a large contingent of workers educated in the class struggle, and 2. The possibility for the workers to develop their own political activity through direct influence on public life in a party press, the party congresses, etc. These conditions are not yet fully formed in Russia. The first, a proletarian vanguard, conscious of its class interests and capable of self-direction in political activity, is only now emerging in Russia. All efforts of socialist agitation and organization should aim to hasten the formation of such a vanguard. A second condition can only be had under a regime of political liberty. All right, so we're going to take this. This is good. Let's go like that instead, and then we're going to input that, and then indispensable conditions, and then we're going to do 1, and then 2. Okay, so the party must be itself the proletariat. It is a concentrated will of individuals and groups representative of the working class. It is self-centralism of the advanced sectors. The proletariat is a ruled majority within its own party. This requires a, quote, large contingent of workers educated in the class struggle, and it requires freedom of expression both inside and outside the party. Okay. With these conclusions, Lenin disagreed violently. He is convinced that all the conditions necessary for the formation of a powerful and centralized party already exist in Russia. He declares that, quote, it is no longer the proletarians, but certain intellectuals in our party who need to be educated in the matters of organization and discipline. Page 145. He glorifies the educative influence of the factory, which he says accustoms the proletariat to, quote, discipline and organization. Page 147. Saying all this, Lenin seems to demonstrate again that his conception of socialist organization is quite mechanistic. The discipline Lenin had in his mind is being implanted in the working class not only by the factory, but also the military and the existing state bureaucracy, by the entire mechanism of the centralized bourgeois state. We misuse words and we practice self-deception when we apply the same term, discipline, to such dissimilar notions as 1. The absence of thought and will in a body with 1,000 automatically moving hands and legs, and 2. The spontaneous coordination of the conscious political acts of a body of men. What is there in common between the regulated docility of an oppressed class and the self-discipline and organization of a class struggle for its emancipation? The self-discipline of the socialist working party democracy is not merely the replacement of the authority of bourgeois rulers with the authority of Socialist Central Committee. The working class will acquire the sense of a new discipline, the freely assumed self-discipline of social democracy, not as a result of the discipline imposed on it by the capitalist state, but by exportating to the last root its old habits of obedience and servility. Centralism in the social sense is not an absolute thing applicable to any phase whatsoever of the labor movement. It is a tendency which becomes real in proportion to the development and political training acquired by the working masses in the course of the struggle. Okay, we're actually going to take all of this. This is a good part. And it keeps screwing up my formatting. Self-display of social. Okay, right here. And then controls on the socialist. Okay. All right, so discipline does not equal absence of thought of executive organs, nor does it mean spontaneous coordination. Discipline in terms of a communist movement is a new form of discipline which is freely assumed by liberating oneself mentally from habits of obedience and servility. Centralism is a tendency that develops with political training through struggle. So basically, what Luxemburg is saying is that rather than enforcing centralism through an organization, or rather through disciplinary methods and stuff like that, instead through education. This is something that I do actually agree with. Through education, people will and through liberating oneself from obedience and servility, people will, of their own accord, discipline themselves. And they will enter into greater and greater centralism because that was effective. Okay. No doubt, the absence of conditions necessary for the complete realization of this kind of centralism in the Russian movement presents a formidable obstacle. It is a mistake to believe that it's possible to substitute, quote, provisionally, the absolute power of a central committee, acting somehow by tacit delegation, for the yet unrealizable rule of the majority of conscious workers of the party, and in this way replace the open control of the working masses over the party organs, with the reverse control by the Central Committee over the revolutionary proletariat. The history of the Russian labor movement suggests the doubtful value of such centralism. An all-powerful center, invested, as Lenin would have it, with the unrestricted right to control and intervene, would be an absurdity if its authority applied only to technical questions, such as the administration of funds, the distribution of tasks among propagandists and agitators, the transportation and circulation of printed matter. The political purpose of an organ having such great powers only if these powers apply to the elaboration of a uniform plan of action, if the central organ assumes the initiative of a vast revolutionary act. But what has been the experience of the Russian socialist movement up till now? The most important and fruitful changes in its tactical policy during the last 10 years have not been the inventions of several leaders, and even less so of any central organizational organs. They have always been the spontaneous product of the movement and ferment. This is true during the first stage of the proletarian movement in Russia, which began with the spontaneous general strike of St. Petersburg in 1896, an event that marks the inception of an epoch of economic struggle by the Russian working people. It is no less true during the following period, introduced by the spontaneous street demonstration of St. Petersburg students in March 1901. The general strike of Rostov-on-Don in 1903, marking the next great tactical turn in the Russian proletarian movement, was also a spontaneous act, quote, all by itself. The strike expanded into political demonstrations, street agitation, great outdoor meetings, which the most optimistic revolutionists would not have dreamed of several years before. Our cause made great gains in these events. However, the initiative and conscious leadership of the social democratic organizations played an insignificant role in its development. It is true that these organizations were not specifically prepared for such happenings. However, the unimportant part played by the revolutionists cannot be explained by this fact. Neither can it be attributed to the absence of an all-powerful central party apparatus, similar to what was asked for by Lenin. The existence of such a guiding center would have probably increased the disorder of the local committees by emphasizing the difference between the eager attack of the masses and the prudent position of the social democracy. The same phenomena, the insignificant part played by the initiative of central party organs and the elaboration of actual tactical policy, can be observed today in Germany and other countries. In general, the tactical policy of the social democracy is not something that may be, quote, invented. It is the product of a series of great creative acts of the often spontaneous class struggle seeking its way forward. The unconscious becomes before the conscious. The logic of the historic process comes before the subjective logic of human beings who participate in the historic process. The tendency is for the directing organs of the Socialist Party to play a conservative role. Experience shows that every time the labor movement wins new terrain, these organs work it to the utmost. They transform it at the same time into a kind of bastion, which holds up advance on a wider scale. The present tactical okay, so what she's trying to say here is the party should essentially play a supportive role to the spontaneous desires of the people, and this central committee makes it too conservative. It makes it so it's in Maoist terms tailist. Um, I'm not sure if I agree with this, but let's continue. Or rather, maybe that's the case with the Russian formulation, um, eh, Lenin's formulation, but I don't necessarily agree that a centralized party with executive organs and stuff like that is necessarily going to be that. Continuing. The present tactical policy of the German social democracy has won universal esteem because it is supple as well as firm. This is a sign of the fine adaptation of the party, in the smallest detail of its everyday activity, to the conditions of a parliamentary regime. The party has made a methodological study of all the resources of this terrain, and knows how to utilize them without modifying its principles. However, the very perfection of this adaptation is already closing vaster horizons of our party. There is a tendency in the party to regard parliamentary tactics as the immutable and specific tactics of socialist activity. People refuse, for example, to consider the possibility, posed by Parvus, of changing our tactical policy in case general suffrage is abolished in Germany. Eventuality not considered entirely improbable by the German social democracy. Such inertia is due, in large degree, to the fact that it is very inconvenient to define, within the vacuum of abstract hypotheses, the lines and forms of still non existent political situations. Evidently, the important thing for the social democracy is not the preparation of a set of directives already for future policy. It is important, 1. To encourage a correct historic appreciation of the forms of struggle corresponding to a given situation, and 2. To maintain an understanding of the relativity of the current phase and the inevitable increase of revolutionary tensions as the final goal of class struggle is approached. Okay. All right, so rather than focus on directives for future struggle, which we cannot make strong determinations on, instead we should educate for class struggle and educate on the necessity of class struggle to eventually lead to revolutionary tension. Okay, so granting, as Lenin wants, such absolute powers of a negative character to the top organ of the party, we strengthen to a dangerous extent the conservatism inherent in such an organ. If the tactics of the Socialist Party are not to be the creation of a central committee, but by the whole party, or better still, of the whole labor movement, then it's clear that the party's sections and federations need the liberty of action which alone will permit them to develop the revolutionary initiative and utilize all the resources of the situation. The ultra-centralism asked by Lenin is full of the sterile spirit of the overseer. It is not a positive and creative spirit. Lenin's concern is not so much to make the activity of the party more fruitful as to control the party, to narrow the movement rather than to develop it, to bind rather than unify it. In the present situation, such an experiment would be undoubtedly dangerous to Russian social democracy. It stands on the eve of decisive battles against Tsarism, is about to enter, or has already entered, on a period of intensified creative activity, during which it will broaden, as is usual for a revolutionary period, its sphere of influence, and will advance spontaneously by leaps and bounds. To attempt to bind the initiative of the party at this moment, to surround it with a network of barbed wire, is to render it incapable of accomplishing the tremendous tasks of the hour. Reminder, this is written in 1904. Alright, so I suppose the next thing that should be read is Luxemburg's work on the Russian Revolution, to see if she has recanted any of her prior positions or improved them. because clearly this did not happen. Okay, so putting the power of all decision making in a enclosed section of the party makes it conservative. This makes it so there is sterility and lack of capacity to utilize all resources. Clear the party sections variation to take productive action. The whole labor movement needs liberty of action, which will allow them to educate themselves through struggle. All right, so putting the power of all decision making in a closed section of the party makes it conservative. This makes it so there's sterility and lack of capacity to utilize all resources. To take productive action, the whole labor movement needs the liberty of action, which will allow them to educate themselves through struggle. So my criticism of this is the same as my criticism that I levied earlier, organic centralism. It's basically saying, hey, look, people just learn through experience the character of the class struggle. My answer is people should be able to learn about the class struggle from researching previous struggles. Okay? Yes, you're going to have your own national conditions. Yes, conditions are going to be different for everybody else. But by and large, you can lay out unifying principles, unifying organizational structure, unifying universalized stuff. We know what we're aiming for. We know the characteristics of capitalism. We know the characteristics of the class struggle. These things should be able to inform us of, some sort of universalized thing that we don't need to be putting people on the lines to fuck around and find out with little support. Education, the whole point of education is that you learn without doing yourself. Doing yourself is important, certainly, but, I don't need to test out some freaking. They're chemicals, right? That if I mix them, then if I breathe into shit, I will instantly die. I'm aware of that through education. I don't need to test it out. In fact, I would really rather not. It sounds dangerous, and yeah. So now, if the Central Committee is not educating people, if it's keeping people from learning themselves, because they're just sitting there expecting the Central Committee to tell them what to do, then that's a problem. But that's an organizational problem. That's not a problem with the existence of a military command. This seems pretty obvious to me, but I'll reiterate. If you're having a problem with the workers educating themselves and then trying to put that into practice, then that's a problem. However, that isn't the same thing as the existence of some sort of centralized organ that makes most of the military decisions being a problem. Again, I go back to the military, right? and I don't profess to be any sort of expert on this, the military allows for a large degree of on the field decision making powers to the various colonels and whatnot, right? They're able to make a very wide decision making ability, as are the soldiers. When you're on the field, in your various conditions, it's up to you to make your determinations. Because if all you're doing is waiting for orders, then that's a problem. You're not going to get anywhere with that. However, that doesn't mean that you don't have your central command. You have to have your central command because you've got different levels of command under different conditions. And this sort of thing functions. And not only does it function, it's also extremely efficient. Extremely efficient. And to be clear, I don't want to replicate a military format for a party. To anybody who has any questions on that end, I will emphatically say I do not want to replicate military organizational format to any party. That is a terrible, terrible idea. You might have a military wing, though. Continuing. In the present situation, such as an experiment would be doubly dangerous to the Russian social democracy. It stands on the eve of such an experiment. She's actually critiquing this position. No, she's critiquing Lenin here. Okay, she's basically saying you should keep to this. You could you should keep to this rather than adopting ultracentralism. Never mind. In the present situation, such an experiment, as if asking the workers to experiment around to figure stuff out, isn't an experiment, would be doubly dangerous to Russian social democracy. It stands on the eve of decisive battles against Tsarism. It is about to enter, or has already entered, on a period of intensified creative activity during which it will broaden, as is usual in the revolutionary period, its sphere of influence and will advance spontaneously by leaps and bounds. To attempt to bind the initiative of the party at this moment, to surround it with a network of barbed wire, is to render it incapable of accomplishing the tremendous tasks of the hour. Yeah, I think we should all remember how the 1905 Russian revolution, not really revolution, went. It didn't go so well at all. The general ideas we have presented on the question of socialist centralism are not by themselves sufficient for the formulations of a constitutional plan suiting the Russian party. In the final instance, a statute of this kind can only be determined by the conditions under which the activity of the organization takes place in a given epoch. The question of the moment in Russia is now how to set in motion a large proletarian organization. No constitutional project can claim infallibility. It must prove itself in fire. But from our general conception of the nature of social democratic organization, we feel justified in deducing that its spirit requires, especially from the inception of the mass party, the coordination and unification of the movement and not its rigid submission to a set of regulations. If the party possesses the gift of political mobility, complemented by unflinching loyalty to principles and concern for unity, we can rest assured that any defects in the party constitution will be corrected in practice. For us, it is not the letter, but the living spirit carried in the organization by the membership that decides the value of this or that organizational form. I'm going to put this in without a explanation. Okay, next section. Rosa Luxemburg's Organizational Questions of the Russian Social Democracy, Part 2. So far, we have examined the problem of centralism from the viewpoint of the general principles of the social democracy, and to some extent in the light of conditions peculiar to Russia. However, the military ultra-centralism cried up by Lenin and his friends is not the product of accidental differences of opinion. It is said to be related to a campaign against opportunism, which Lenin has carried to the smallest organizational detail. Quote, "It is important," says Lenin, page 52, to forge a more or less effective weapon against opportunism. End quote. He believes that opportunism springs specifically from the characteristic leaning of intellectuals to decentralization and disorganization, from their aversion for strict discipline and, quote, bureaucracy, which is, however, necessary for the functioning of the party. Lenin says that intellectuals remain individualists and tend to anarchism even after they have joined the socialist movement. According to him, it is only among intellectuals that we note a repugnance for the absolute authority of the Central Committee. The authentic proletarian, Lenin suggests, stands by reason of his class instinct, a kind of voluptuous pleasure in abandoning himself to the clutch of the firm leadership and pitiless discipline. Quote, to oppose bureaucracy to democracy, writes Lenin, is to contrast the organizational principle of revolutionary social democracy to the method of opportunistic organization. End quote. Page 151. He declares that a similar conflict between centralizing and autonomous tendencies is taking place in all countries where reformism and revolutionary socialism meet face to face. He points in particular to the recent controversy in the German social democracy on the question of the degree of freedom of action to be allowed by the party of the socialist representatives in the legislative assemblies. Let's examine the parallels drawn by Lenin. First, it is important to point out that the glorification of the supposed genius of proletarians in the matter of socialist organization and a general distrust of intellectuals are not necessarily signs of, quote, revolutionary Marxist mentality. It is very easy to demonstrate that such arguments themselves are an expression of opportunism. I agree with that, by the way. Yeah, I actually significantly agree with that. Antagonism between purely proletarian elements and non-proletarian intellectuals in the labor movement is raised an ideological issue by the following trends. The semi-anarchism of the French syndicalists, whose watchword is, quote, beware of the politician. English trade unionism, full mistrust of the, quote, socialist visionaries. And if our information is correct, the, quote, pure economism, represented a short while ago within the Russian social democracy of Rabotchaya Misal, labor thought, which was printed secretly in St. Petersburg. In most socialist parties in Western Europe, there is undoubtedly a connection between opportunism and the intellectuals, quote unquote, as well as between opportunism and decentralizing tendencies within the labor movement. But nothing is more contrary to the historical dialectic method of Marxists thought than to separate social phenomena from their historical soil and to present these phenomena as abstract formulas having an absolute general application. Reasoning abstractly, we may say that the, quote, intellectual, a social element that has emerged out of the bourgeoisie and is therefore alien to the proletariat, enters the socialist movement not because of his natural class inclinations, but in spite of them. For this reason, he is more liable to opportunist aberrations than the proletarian. The latter, we say, can be expected to find a definite revolutionary point of support in his class interests as long as he does not leave his original environment, the laboring mass. But the concrete form assumed by this inclination of the intellectual towards opportunism, and, above all, the manner in which this tendency expresses itself in organizational questions, depend every time on his given social milieu. Bourgeois parliamentarism is a definite base of the phenomena observed by Lenin in the German, French, and Italian socialist movements. This parliamentarism is a breeding ground of all opportunist tendencies now existing in Western social democracy. The kind of parliamentarism we now have in France, Italy, and Germany provides the soil for such illusions of current opportunism as an overvaluation of social reforms, class and party collaboration, the hope of pacific development towards socialism, etc. It does so by placing intellectuals, acting in the capacity of parliamentarians, above the proletariat, and by separating intellectuals from proletarians inside the socialist movement itself. With the growth of the labor movement, parliamentarism becomes a springboard for political careerists. That is why so many ambitious failures from the bourgeois flock to banners of socialist parties. Another source of contemporary opportunism is the considerable material means and influence of large social democratic organizations. The party acts as a bulwark, protecting class movements against digressions in the direction of more bourgeois parliamentarism. To triumph, these tendencies must destroy the bulwark. They must dissolve the active, class-conscious sector of the proletariat in the enforced mass of the, quote, electorate. That's how the, quote, autonomist and decentralizing tendencies arise in our social democratic parties. We notice that these tendencies suit definite political ends. They cannot be explained as an attempt by referring to the intellectual psychology, to supposedly innate instability of character. Geez, Lenin actually said this? Wow. Okay. They can only be explained by considering the needs of the bourgeois parliamentary politician, that is, by opportunist politics. The situation is quite different in Tsarist Russia. Opportunism in the Russian labor movement is, generally speaking, not the byproduct of social democratic strength or the decomposition of the bourgeoisie. It is a product of the backward political condition of Russian society. The milieu where intellectuals are recruited for socialism in Russia is much more declassed and far less bourgeois than Western Europe. Added to the immaturity of the Russian proletarian movement, this circumstance is an influence for wide theoretical wanderings, which ranges from the complete negation of the political aspect of the labor movement to the unqualified belief in the effectiveness of isolated terrorist attacks, or even the political indifference sought in the swamps of liberalism and Kantian idealism. However, the intellectual within the Russian social democratic movement can only be attracted to an act of disorganization. It is contrary to the general outlook of the Russian intellectuals' milieu. There is no bourgeois parliament in Russia to favor this tendency. The Western intellectual who professes at the moment the, quote, cult of the ego, and colors even his socialist yearnings with an aristocratic morale, is not the representative of the bourgeois intelligentsia in general. He represents only a certain phase of social development. He is a product of bourgeois decadence. The Narodniki, the populists in Russia, of 1875 called on the Russian intelligentsia to lose themselves in the peasant mass. The ultra-civilized followers of Tolstoy seek today to escape to the life of the, quote, simple folk. Similarly, the partisans of, quote, pure economism in the Russian social democracy want us to bow before the calloused hand of labor. If instead of mechanically applying to Russia a formula elaborated in Western Europe, we approach the problem of organization from the angle of conditions specific to Russia, we arrive at conclusions that are diametrically opposed to Lenin's. To attribute to opportunism an invariable preference for a definite form of organization, that is, decentralization, is to miss the essence of opportunism. On the question of organization, or any other question, opportunism only knows one principle, the absence of principle. Opportunism chooses its means of action with the aim of suiting the given circumstances at hand, providing these means appear to lead toward the ends in view. Okay, we're going to take this, and we're going to revert and put it in here, because it continues to fuck up with my my formatting. Okay, so opportunism arises out of material conditions, and the form of opportunism is dependent. It is ultimately acting without principles and aims at achieving a specific end goal without also paying attention to the whole of the needs of the movement. Therefore, your party structure needs to be organized to stop opportunism in a way that matches your material conditions. Okay. Back to the text. If, like Lenin, we define opportunism as a tendency that paralyzes the independent revolutionary movement of the working class and transforms it into an instrument of ambitious bourgeois intellectuals, We must also recognize that in the initial stage of labor movement, this end is more easily attained as a result of rigorous centralization rather than by decentralization. It is by extreme centralization that a young, uneducated proletarian movement can be most completely handed over to the intellectual leaders staffing a central committee. Yeah, that's fair. Also in Germany, at the start of the social democratic movement, and before the emergence of a solid nucleus of conscious proletarians and a tactical policy based on experience, partisans of the two opposite types of organization faced each other in argument. The General Association of German Workers, founded by Lassalle, stood for extreme centralization. The principle of autonomism was supported by the party, which was organized at the Eisenach Congress with the collaboration of W. Liebknecht and A. August Bebel. The tactical policy of the Eisenachers was quite confused, yet they contributed vastly more to the awakening of class consciousness in the German masses than the Lassallians. Very early, the workers played a preponderant role in that party, as is demonstrated by a number of worker publications in the provinces, and there is a rapid extension of the range of movement. At the same time, the Lassallians, in spite of their experiments with dictators, quote unquote, led their faithful from one misadventure to another. In general, it is rigorous despotic centralism that is preferred by opportunist intellectuals at a time when the revolutionary element among the workers still lacked cohesion and the movement is groping its way, as is the case now in Russia. In a later phase, under a parliamentary regime and in connection with a strong labor party, the opportunist tendencies in the intellectuals express themselves in an inclination towards, quote, decentralization. Actually, I wanted to take this and so opportunists tend to like opportunity organizations where their mandates are unquestionable, and organizations without strict definition have a tendency to fall to opportunistic leaders if they are so centralized. So, yes, but also at the same time, I think that it's kind of simplifying things a little. But I won't go into too many details. Okay. If we assume the viewpoint claimed as his own by Lenin, and we fear the influence of intellectuals in the proletarian movement, we can conceive of no greater danger to the Russian party than Lenin's plan of organization. Nothing will more surely enslave a young labor movement to an intellectual elite hungry for power than its bureaucratic straitjacket, which will immobilize the movement and turn it into an automaton manipulated by a central committee. On the other hand, there is no more effective guarantee against opportunist intrigue and personal ambition than the independent revolutionary action of the proletariat, as a result of which the workers acquire a sense of political responsibility and self-reliance. What is today only a phantom haunting Lenin's imagination may become reality tomorrow. Okay. I'm not going to summarize that. I think that's short enough. Let's not forget that the revolution soon to break out in Russia will be a bourgeois and not proletarian revolution. This modifies radically all the conditions of social struggle. The Russian intellectuals, too, will rapidly become imbued with bourgeois ideology. The social democracy is at present the only guide of the Russian proletariat. But on the day after the revolution, we shall see the bourgeoisie, and above all the bourgeois masses, as a stepping stone to their domination. The game of bourgeois demagogues will be made easier if at the present stage the spontaneous action, initiative, and political sense of the advancing sections of the working class are hindered in their development, restricted by the protectorate of an authoritarian central committee. More important is the fundamental falseness of the idea underlying the plan of unqualified centralism. The idea that the road to opportunism can be barred by means and clauses in the party constitution. Impressed by recent happenings in the socialist parties of France, Italy, and Germany, the Russian Social Democrats tend to regard opportunism as an alien ingredient brought into the labor movement by representatives of bourgeois democracy. If that were so, no penalties provided by a party constitution could stop this intrusion. This afflux of non-proletarian recruits to the party of the proletariat is a profound effect of profound social causes, such as the economic collapse of the pay bourgeoisie, the bankruptcy of bourgeois liberalism, and the degeneration of bourgeois democracy. It is naive to hope to stop this current by means of a formula written down in a constitution. A manual of regulations may master the life of a small sect or private circle. An historical current, however, will pass through the mesh of the most subtly worded paragraph. It is furthermore untrue than that to repel the elements pushed towards the socialist movement by the decomposition of bourgeois society means to defend the interests of the working class. But social democracy has always contended that it represents not only the class interests of the proletariat, but also the progressive aspirations of the whole contemporary society. It represents the interests of all who are oppressed by bourgeois domination. This must not be understood merely in the sense that all these interests are ideally contained in the socialist program. Historic evolution translates a given proposition into reality. In its capacity as a political party, the social democracy becomes a haven of all discontented elements in our society and thus the entire people, as contrasted to the tiny minority of capitalist masters. But socialists must always know how to subordinate the anguish, rancor, and hope of this motley aggregation to the supreme goal of the working class. The social democracy must enclose the tumult of the non-proletarian Protestants against the existing society within the bounds of the revolutionary action of the proletariat. It must assimilate the elements that come to it. So the party needs to bring all the people protesting the bourgeois order within, but bend them to the will of the proletarian struggle. This is only possible if the social democracy already contains a strong, politically educated, proletarian nucleus class conscious enough to be able, as up to now in Germany, to pull along in its tow the D-class and petty bourgeois elements to join the party. In that case, greater strictness in the application of the principle of centralization and more severe discipline, specifically formulated in party bylaws, may be an effective safeguard against the opportunist danger. That's how the revolutionary socialist movement in France defended itself against the Jaristist confusion. A modification of the constitution at this German social democracy in that direction would have been a very timely measure. But even here, we should not think of the party constitution as a weapon that is somehow self-sufficient. It can at most be a coercive instrument enforcing the will of the proletarian majority in the party. If this majority is lacking, then the most dire sanctions on paper will be of no avail. Okay, and then I'm also going to get this bit. Okay, so the absorption of other social groups into the will of the proletariat requires the proletarian nucleus that can utilize party bylaws to maintain the following: strong basis in the party, it must be majority, politically educated, class conscious, able to use strict centralization and severe discipline. Okay. However, the influx of bourgeois elements into the party is far from being the only cause of the opportunist trends that are now raising their heads into social democracy. Another cause is the very nature of socialist activity and the contradictions inherent in it. The international movement of the proletariat towards its complete emancipation is a process peculiar to the following respect. For the first time in this history of civilization, the people are expressing their will consciously and in opposition to all ruling classes. But this will can only be satisfied beyond the limits of the existing system. Now, the mass can only acquire and strengthen this will in the course of day-to-day struggle against the existing social order, that is, within the limits of capitalist society. On the one hand, we have the mass, on the other, its historical goal, located outside the existing society. On the one hand, we have the day-to-day struggle, on the other, the social revolution. Such are the terms of the dialectical contradiction through which socialist movement makes its way. Okay. I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to summarize it just yet. It follows that this movement can best advance by attacking betwixt and between the two dangers by which it is constantly being threatened. One is the loss of its mass character, the other, the abandonment of its goal. One is the danger of sinking back into the condition of a sect, the other, the danger of becoming a movement of bourgeois social reform. That is why it is illusory and contrary to historic experience to hope to fix, once and for always, the direction of the revolutionary social struggle with the aid of formal means, which are expected to secure the labor movement against all possibilities of opportunist digression. Marxist theory offers us a reliable instrument, enabling us to recognize and combat typical manifestations of opportunism. But the socialist movement is a mass movement. Its perils are not the product of the insidious machinations of individuals and groups. They rise out of unavoidable social conditions. We cannot secure ourselves in advance against all possibilities of opportunist deviation. Such dangers can be overcome only by the movement itself, certainly with the aid of Marxist theory, but only after the dangers in question have taken tangible form in practice. Looked at from this angle, opportunism appears to be a product and inevitable phase of the historical development of the labor movement. Also not going to summarize this just yet. The social Russian democracy arose a short while ago. The political conditions under which the proletarian movement is developing in Russia are quite abnormal. In that country, opportunism is to a large extent a byproduct of the groping and experimentation of socialist activity seeking to advance over a terrain that resembles no other in Europe. In view of this, we find most astonishing the claim that it's possible to avoid any possibility of opportunism in Russia, in the Russian movement by writing down certain words instead of others in the party constitution. Such an attempt to exercise opportunism by I think she means exercise, opportunism by means of a scrap of paper may turn out to be extremely harmful, not to opportunism, but to the socialist movement. Such a natural pulsation of a living organism, and you weaken it, and you diminish its resistance and combative spirit, and in this instance, not only against opportunism, but also, and that is certainly of great importance, against this existing social order. The proposed means turn against the end they are supposed to serve. In Lenin's anxious desire to establish the guardianship of an omniscient and omnipotent Central Committee in order to protect so promising and vigorous a labor movement from any misstep, we recognize the symptoms of the same subjectivism that has already played more than one trick on socialist thinking in Russia. It is amusing to note the strange somersaults that the respected human, quote, ego has to perform in recent Russian history. Knocked to the ground, almost reduced to dust by Russian absolutism, the, quote, ego takes revenge by turning to revolutionary activity. In the shape of a committee of conspirators, in the name of a non-existent will of the people, it seats itself on a kind of throne and proclaims it is all-powerful. The note says the reference is to the conspiratorial circle which attacked the Tsarism from 1879 to 1883 by means of terrorist act and finally assassinated Alexander II. Back to text. But the object proves to be stronger. The knout is triumphant, for the Tsars might seem to be the legitimate expression of history. But in time, we see appear on the scene an even more, quote, legitimate child of history, the Russian labor movement. For the first time, bases for the formation of a real, quote, people's will are laid in Russian soil. But here's the ego of the Russian revolutionary again. Pirouetting on its head, it once more proclaims itself to be an all-powerful director of history, this time with the title of His Excellency, the Central Committee of the Social Democratic Party of Russia. The nimble acrobat fails to perceive that the only subject, quote-unquote, which merits today the role of director is the collective ego of the working class. The working class demands the right to make its mistakes and learn the dialectic of history. Let us speak plainly. Historically, the errors committed by a truly revolutionary movement are infinitely more fruitful than the infallibility of the cleverest Central Committee. This is more of the just let them make their own mistakes and they'll learn, and then not write them down for some reason. This is the same stuff. The exact. Okay, at least Luxemburg is basically saying you need to educate, right? Learn from history. But in my mind, learning from history would involve actually, going in and writing down about your experiences, and then in addition to that, advising, do that, this and that in these circumstances. And Rosa does do that. She says, okay, according to these dialectical conditions, under these conditions you should centralize, or under these conditions you should decentralize, and stuff. I don't know. I'll finish the summarization and the recording. That's the end of today's session. Hopefully, I can find something that fits what I'm looking for a bit more. I don't know if that's going to be the case. Thanks for coming, everybody. That's the end of the session.